And welcome back to another Twinmotion video where we cover Lumen. Lumen is awesome. So first of all, what is Lumen? It is a real-time global illumination system. Fantastic. So this originally came out within 2023.2 within the first preview. So we're going to dive a bit deeper into it. But before we get into it, if at any point in this video you happen to learn something, please demolish that like button. It really helps me out quite a lot. Also consider subscribing if you find this video helpful. Okay, so Lumen. Lumen was originally introduced within Unreal Engine 5, and like a lot of other features that we get in Twinmotion, it's just kind of a not even downgraded or ported version. It's just simply a Twinmotion version of what we see in Unreal Engine 5. I will say it's very simple to use, and what we get out of it is amazing. So again, it is a global illumination system, all happening in real time, and we have one. Obviously, we're looking at one. We'll get to it in just a second, but a couple of prerequisites that I want to say that I did point out in the update video, but these are very important. If I go to Edit and Preferences and make sure we go to Graphic Hardware Support and then DirectX 12. So you'll have to have a certain video card, I believe, well, first of all, a ray tracing card, first of all, which is going to be in NVIDIA cards 2000 and later. So a 2000 card, 3000, even 4 especially, that will work for sure. But you have to have DirectX 12. And then whenever we come to the quality, we have to have at least high or ultra chosen, or else it just will not work. So if you have some other custom version here, as long as you have, I would say at least these top few, all but point cloud at least, high or ultra, you're fine. But just know that you're going to have the hardware to do this. It takes a decent amount of hardware. So that is a prerequisite. Okay, so here we go. And like I said, we've always had a global illumination system within Twinmotion. That's nothing new, but I definitely want to show you the difference between what we've always had and Lumen, because it's substantially different. Okay, so where do I find Lumen? Well, let's go to Ambiance, and we can see that I have real-time or path tracer. So as of last year, we know we got the path tracer. We had it. We know what it's like. It's basically rendering this. It's really nice. And the difference, of course, between the path tracer and the real time is that this is obviously not real time. This takes time, and if I move around, it has to recompute, re-render, take time, all of that. And yes, while this might be beneficial for exporting, this is totally not what we're looking for. When it comes to moving around a scene, exporting a GIF or video, this is not what we want. We want it real time. So when I come to render here in Ambiance, I need to go to real time. And so right now you can see I have Lumen on and it looks really nice, but let's go to standard. So this is standard, and standard is what we've had in Twinmotion for a very long time, basically since it came over 2019 probably. And so it isn't bad. You know, it's not bad, but it's also not great. Yeah, it just kind of is what it is. And so you can see as soon as I toggle from standard to Lumen, just immediately, like we can see nice ambient occlusion, like the shadows, everything looks a little more crisp, a little more real. But what I want to do is start to get into some of these settings, because this is what is really important and really going to tell the story about how to use Lumen. So before we really get into it, I do want to preface and say that in the description, I have a link to kind of the very, very detailed version of what this video will be, because Twinmotion has a fantastic article on exactly how to use it, the nuances and every little thing with it. And yeah, we're going to cover a lot of it in this video, but if there are specifics that you need to know a little bit more, I would look there, because there's quite a lot, even examples about things to use. So one more kind of prerequisite, but it's more of like a kind of a flag that you need to be aware of, is whenever you go to import, and we go, let's just say we want to import an object, and I can import just this test FBX. Most of this it's all fine. And I've gone on rants before about the way the collapse is set up, whether it's through keep hierarchy, collapse material, or collapse all. Real quick, keep hierarchy keeps every object individual. It's its own object. Every wall is its own wall, and all of that. Collapse by material means every object that shares the same material becomes one object. And then collapse all, everything in that import becomes one object. So I'm completely against the last one in 90% of circumstances, of course. But for this, and particularly Lumen, we want to keep hierarchy. Again, this is nothing new, of course, but we want to keep hierarchy because the way Lumen is computing light and having light bounce off surfaces and whatnot, basically the more elements, the better for one, but two, each element being its own actual element and not just one big model is going to allow the global illumination system to compute more realistically. The wall is going to perform more like a single wall that it is, as opposed to one giant wall or one giant model filled with a bunch of walls. It's hard to explain, but it's a type of thing that you could see in that article for one, but two, just it kind of makes sense. Like you want each model to be its own individual, each piece to be its own portion of the whole model. Okay. And then moving down, the UVs and normals, that's all fine, but what we really care about is a unit conversion. And again, this is not the type of thing that you really need to worry about 90% of the time, I would say, but it's always on auto. And I would usually keep it on auto, but just know that auto is 1, which means it's a scale of 1. And so that any model that is imported into Twinmotion, whether it is through some sort of geometry or direct link or whatnot, is going to come in at 1 scale. And that is just the scale that it was exported from whatever program it came from. The thing to note with Lumen is that there are some cases where the scale is way too high or way too low for the object, so that the global illumination system is unable to really compute everything about it or like enough about it. And so these are things that we'll get into as we look into the specific settings. But if you notice that there are things that are not computing based on like shadows and light and all this, you might want to check your units. And so obviously we can do this here by auto. I'm not even going to import this in. But if I were to select an object and I go to properties, I can see here the XYZ, the scale is going to be the exact same. So by default, everything's going to come in at 1 or 100%. 1 is 100%. Just kind of know that. So here, of course, what we really care about is the ambiance. Going back to Lumen, ambiance here. All right. So again, it needs to be real time. We need to select Lumen. Sorry, moving down here, we can see the scene detail. So there's not a whole lot to say about scene detail other than it literally is the scene detail. And if I hover over here, we can get a little bit more, which is like set the size of which objects are cold. And so what does that really mean? Well, that means whether or not the smaller the object we see will be included within the computation of this real-time global illumination system. So basically, the more detail you have, the smaller the object that will be allowed to be rendered in real time. And then view distance, again, this is just kind of something I don't typically like to mess with. I think the standard is 400. I think so. It doesn't matter so much because 400 meters is much larger than most of my models that I'm working with. And obviously, if you're working with a huge master plan, make sure the distance is here. But this is just the distance from the camera that the global illumination, again, using Lumen, will be calculated. And then finally here, the lighting update speed is, I believe, default of 1. It is just how quickly or how often, not necessarily how quickly, but I guess how quickly and often that global illumination system is going to be updated throughout. And so it's not necessarily 1 as in 1 second or something, but it's just the frequency. So if you can put it up to 4, so this is in theory 4 times as fast. I will say if you put it down to 0, then no matter what kind of lighting updates or whatever you do, that will not be updated, because in doing this, you're technically saying don't update right now. So I would always keep it at least 1. This is kind of a good standard. And scene detail at 1 is generally fine as well, and you can go up or down from there as needed. So finally, there's this check mark here that is visualize mesh conflicts. And this is really important because this is going to start to tell us where Lumen is being calculated. And this is what I was saying that we want to use a lot along with these settings, even when it comes to the import, that shows us whether this particular element is being computed. So let's go ahead and check this. And immediately this looks terrible. Obviously, we're not going to be rendering this out. This is more of a check for us to say, yeah, this element is included in the global illumination or not. Obviously, when I go to standard, none of this matters, but Lumen is where it does matter. So the thing to note here is that yellow is the object itself. That particular object is either too big or too small. And that just means that the way that the light is bouncing off and that Lumen is computing light across this element, it just happens to be too big or too small for that to work properly. And then finally, the magenta that we see, and there's a lot more of that than I would have expected, especially down here. I'm not sure. Maybe this might be because I've sloped the grade a bit, and I'm not sure what it is. But what this means is that it's too complex. Basically, every single model element, at least unless it's a solid, is going to have some sort of triangulation. It's going to be tessellated, and that's going to be essentially the model data. And basically, the number of triangles you have, or like the more you have, it's equate to the more detail you have. Of course, if you have more detail, it's going to be more difficult for materials to populate correctly, and it's going to take a lot more hardware and more backbones for any sort of software to calculate lighting. In this case, Lumen is saying that all of these magenta spaces, all these magenta faces are not going to be computed within Lumen itself. So there's not a great fix to that, but I will say the example that I left in the description of that article, it does give a lot of examples that show scaling up or down based on some of what you see, because it might be that some of these services are just too big, and that scaling them down will really help it out and allow Lumen to literally work. So that's cool. Now, let's come in here, and I want to actually affect some of these top sliders, because these top sliders are going to actually affect how much yellow you see. I don't think magenta so much, but mainly yellow. And the yellow, again, means it's too big or too small. And really what we're doing with the scene detail and distance is whether or not a particular object is going to be computed by Lumen. That's really all we're thinking. So whenever you're affecting these sliders, just kind of put in your mind, I'm doing this to decide whether this particular element is going to be calculated by Lumen's global illumination system. So I want to start to increase the scene detail, and you can watch and see what happens. So doing this, I start to have reduced yellow elements, reduced yellow faces, which is fantastic, because that means that we're going to see more Lumen calculated throughout the scene. Now, it might be hard to tell because there's just not that much, but also I'm going to bring it down, and you can see less will be calculated. And honestly, when I bring it all the way down, only very few elements in my scene will be calculated. And obviously, I don't want this at all, but I want to leave it at 1. So I particularly want to come in here, and I've got this super thin mullion, and honestly, this could never be constructed. It's way too thin to be the mullion that it is. So it's mullions like this that, even with the detail being maxed out, you can just kind of expect that Lumen is not going to calculate all the way in here, just the way it is. So we can see in here, yeah, these faces are really small. There's a lot going on. And so likewise, if I come over here to this bench, apparently these particular faces, these particular triangles within the model itself are too complex. So I can solve that by maybe increasing the scale of the bench. I don't want to do that. Or if I could re-export the bench, I could have less triangles and it would be a little less detailed, and so that the light would work correctly. But I would really only worry about that if that were the whole bench. Obviously, it's not the whole bench. The rest of the bench is working beautifully, and this looks pretty good. You can see some slight issues here, but it really is not that bad. Where I would start to be a little more concerned is if I saw some of these giant magenta faces. I might address this, and especially this entire walkway. I don't care about that necessarily, because that's usually not where I'm focusing on in this model, but I do want to come over here and just start to see, like, clearly, you can see the distance playing in as well. You know, as I move closer and further away from the camera, I'm getting more or less computed. And so one way around that is just to put this much higher than you're seeing, and that's not going to be an issue at all, first of all. But then I can slide the detail, and immediately we're getting all of those back, and that's fantastic. Something to note, that vegetation is not gonna matter. You know, vegetation, unfortunately, via the scatter tool or paint, I believe, is just not going to be calculated, and that's just too bad. It is what it is. Obviously, a lot of information is in here, so that is that top box. And again, we really want to leverage this visualized mesh conflicts to determine what we're really getting. The final thing here is, if we wanted to address this yellow, I could change the material. And so right now it's water. And so that's probably what the real reason. If I change this to this kind of ridiculous concrete then, and go back to my Lumen, I could see that, of course, yeah, it's just fine. You know, it's no longer yellow, and it will compute. So I will say, just kind of expect that with water, because it's water, like that's all water, that type of thing. So, okay, happy with all of that. Let's move on to the next here, which is the reflection settings. And so I think by default, it is set to full. And so what is this? Well, if we have it on full, then it basically will use real time. Everything will be calculated in real time. And the difference between full and optimize is that optimize will use cached lighting values of elements to hopefully maintain the performance and the quality that you should hope to achieve with Lumen. Now, given the system that I have, I can run with full no problem. And I'd recommend you have a system that does run on full here. So you're not getting, I guess, let's say, slightly false values, because really, when we look at full, it's all real time, and it's literally what we see is what's happening and everything like that. So let's uncheck this first of all. And so moving on down, the quality, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's going to be hard to see, but if I bring it all the way down, we can start to see some of the, lacking of quality in some of these glazing elements. As soon as I go off 0, that's kind of fixed. So I think between 0 and 10, a 5 is a good place to land. I mean, really by default, somewhere in the middle is a good place to land. And then bounce count, I think 2 or 3 is the default, and simply it is what it is. How many times is the light bouncing off of surfaces, or how many surfaces does the light bounce off of? And if you think about it, you can bring it all the way down to 1, but whenever you go from 1 to 2, look at, like, there's a vast difference in some of these glazing elements. And why might that be? Well, this is just a theory, but when you think about, let's say light is coming from a light bulb or the sun, as it comes down, it's going to hit the surface and it's going to bounce just once. If it bounces just once, then we're not seeing any sort of redirection, or let's say a level more leveling of light. It's just bouncing once and being reflected, and that's it. So I think personally, at a minimum, while the default might be 3, I want to put that bounce at 2, because that means all of a sudden we're getting some of these crisscross and like real actions, I guess you could say, of the way a light might perform. Because light bouncing just once, it's mostly like a mirror. And so you're saying the light is going to act like all these surfaces are a mirror when they're not mirrors, and we're hoping to see through them and create shadows and all this. And clearly that's not the case. So that's my 2 cents. Bounce count at least 2. Honestly, the quality at 8 is not a whole lot different than 2, but it will make a difference on export for sure. Okay, and just know that only the settings, the top settings up here, primarily the scene detail and view distance, will be affected by the visualize mesh conflict. So you won't be able to really notice any change with the rest. If I change the quality, I'm still only seeing what's being computed based on my detail and distance. That's just the way it is. So another note there. And then finally, the shadows. These types of settings are nothing new. It's just these settings will apply directly to Lumen. So in this case, shadows, basically how far beyond my camera are shadows going to populate. And if I bring this all the way down to 0, or let's say 10 being the minimum, then 10 meters in front of me, which in case is here, I'm really not seeing shadows. And it's so weird to see kind of this flat looking view that doesn't have any shadows. So bring this up and have it include your scene. It just makes a big difference. And obviously I would recommend that. And then shadow bias, which it's a bit interesting. I'm going to go ahead and read this because it is a little interesting. Increasing the value reduces self-shadowing artifact on objects, but can also reduce the accuracy of shadows. So I want accurate shadows, but at the same time, I don't want to see these kind of random shadows appearing on kind of objects that really shouldn't exist. So one example are these rings here. When I bring the shadow bias all the way down, we start to see that there's like odd shadows that show up like in the center. And again, it's very subtle. It might be hard to tell if you're not looking for it, but as I come off the minimum value of 0.1, you can see that those shadows, and even some shadows beyond in some of these metal elements, they start to relax and kind of blend into everything lighting wise. And so I wouldn't keep anything at a minimum. If you have to keep things at a minimum, I'd get a better video card, to be honest with you. But sliding this up is pretty good. Again, this is the type of thing where the further you go, you might notice a little bit difference, but still right in the middle is probably a good sweet spot. So we looked at quite a lot with Lumen. A couple other things I want to mention is that in that article, emissive materials tend to throw off kind of the whole scene, which is so interesting. And I think it's just kind of the way that the Lumen is set up right now. It just can't handle that very well. So I would minimize, if not completely eliminate, emissive materials, either one in your model or just in the view, or maybe just hide them whenever you're trying to do anything like high quality with Lumen, that type of thing. And, I'm sure that type of thing will change. Look into the description for that article. It will be really helpful. I gave it a good read, and it really is helpful. So The last thing I want to do, and this is not necessarily a whole lot different, but I want to go to my media. And because this applies to media, so I'm probably going to use this shot for the thumbnail, but you can let me know if I do. And so I want to look at basically the same settings within here. And obviously they're the exact same, which is really nice, but this is specific to media mode, is specific to this image, all of these settings. And again, I'm able to max all these things out, but a few things I want to mention, obviously. I can do standard Lumen. This will apply on export, which is fantastic. And again, what I think I want to do in the future is a path tracer versus Lumen export video. Maybe you looking at the same image, just one-to-one and see what happens, see what we get. But because I can afford it, I want the scene detail max. I want my view distance, far enough out. I want my lighting speed update to be this particular value. But I do want to point this out. With a still image export, the lighting update speed does not matter. I could, as long as, I probably wouldn't want it at 0 because I would have wanted it to compute all the values based on the things that I've done, like settings I've changed in the actual media. So I want it off 1, but maybe 1 is fine, is the point, because any value here is going to be completely unaffected by whenever I export it. Having this at a different value won't matter. It will matter a lot if I'm exporting a GIF or a screen share or like a video. That will really matter. But the nice thing again is I can visualize my mesh conflict and see, what am I getting in my actual shot? Is Lumen even going to contribute to the things that I hope that it would be in my export? And if I bring my scene detail down, there's a point to where I wouldn't see what I want to see as far as Lumen goes. Okay, awesome. Obviously, I don't want to leave that on, but I don't believe it would export like that, so don't worry about that. And then finally, as far as the quality and balancing out, this is really where Lumens will shine when it comes to exporting, because if you have it on full, that doesn't matter as much as the quality and bounce count being as high as it possibly can, because again, optimizer versus full is just kind of how it's running right now, to the best of my knowledge. I'm pretty sure, because this is just how it's running, and then this is what's happening when it exports. The quality's max and bounce count is there. And then obviously shadows. If you can afford your shadow bias of maybe the sweet spot 75, I don't know, somewhere like that, but make sure your shadows are capturing the entire scene. But I think I'm going to use this for the thumbnail. You can let me know what you think, obviously, because this will be fully using Lumen, and I can't say that I am not impressed by this. It's looking pretty good, I have to say. And because it's so easy to use, it literally is as easy as the standard. You can see the difference between standard looks good, but then this, obviously, it's a little blown out, but the quality's not there because we're looking at it in real time, but the export. So there might be something to using standard versus Lumen at certain times. That'll be up to you to decide based on what you're doing, though. So that will do it for this video. We looked at the new feature within Twinmotion 2023.2, and that is Lumen, which is awesome. It's a real-time global illumination system that I plan to use basically all the time. We looked through all the settings, and again, in the description is that article with everything you might need to know about Lumen. Look for that Lumen versus Path Tracer video in the future. It will be out for sure. And let me know if you have any questions down in the comments below. Also, if you happen to learn something, please demolish that like button. It really helps me out quite a lot, and tells me that you might not even like the video. That would be nice to know. Also, consider subscribing if you would. That would help too. Well, and that will do it. I will see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day, and thanks so much for watching.